Om. Is it fine? Om. Vasamsi jirnani yatha vihaya navani grinati naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jirnan anyani sanyati navani dehi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. As a person casts off worn-out garments and puts on new ones, likewise at the time of death, the soul casts off its worn-out body and puts on a new one. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 22. Happy Father's Day, everyone. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for the beautiful song. It's a great gift for the fathers out there and for everyone else here. It's beautiful, and thank you for practicing so much. Perfect segue into our talk. Have we lived before? And even if we have lived before, does it even matter? So, spoiler alert, I'll be saying yes and yes to both these questions. I assume you already figured that. I'm a Vedantan after all. But there are actually a lot of complexities in these doctrines, karma and rebirth, that are worth talking about. In fact, I often get from other Hindus who come up to me privately and say, "You don't really believe in rebirth, do you?" Which it's a reflection of their own minds, because many Hindus now, they are educated and they're just somehow skeptical, you know. And they call themselves Hindu. They're happy to call themselves Hindu, but they're like, but I don't really need to accept karma and rebirth, do I? It reminds me a little bit of Catholics who, they call themselves Catholic, but they don't like some of the doctrines of Catholicism, like this extreme pro-life stance and these other things. And so they'll kind of can really drop those doctrines. So in Hinduism, I often find that it's Hinduism minus karma and rebirth. Why? Because I think that there's some intuition, some sense among many modern educated Hindus that there's something irrational, something superstitious, something implausible about the doctrines of karma and rebirth, possibly also because of their mistaken understanding of these doctrines. Maybe they don't understand the subtleties of these doctrines. Maybe they don't understand that they're actually very sophisticated arguments in support of these doctrines. So I want to get into some of these details and talk about these doctrines of karma and rebirth in some depth. So I'll be talking about four main things, just to give you a sense of the structure of the talk. The first is, what exactly are the doctrines of karma and rebirth, especially on the basis of our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. Second, what are some of the main arguments in support of these doctrines of karma and rebirth? What are some of the main arguments against the doctrines of karma and rebirth? How do we respond to those objections to these doctrines? So, second part will be, what are the arguments for karma and rebirth? Third part of this talk will be arguments against karma and rebirth. And finally, and most importantly in a way, why does all this matter? Why does any of this matter to us? As spiritual aspirants, how does this belief in karma and rebirth inform our day-to-day spiritual life and spiritual practice? So those are the four main topics I want to cover today. So first, what exactly are the doctrines of karma and rebirth? And here, as usual, in Hinduism is such a vast religion that it's very difficult to make generalizations about these doctrines. There are subtle nuances in different Hindu traditions, which I'm not going to really go into in this talk because it'll take me too far afield and it'll take too much time. If you're interested, this entire talk is based on a book I'm writing, which I'm almost finishing up basically, called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. It's a little book, and it'll be published by Cambridge University Press next year, sometime in 2025. And in that book, I devote the whole chapter 2 to discussing these nuances and subtleties in different Hindu traditions concerning the doctrines of karma and rebirth. I won't go into that today. If we were to make a generalization and say, what exactly is the karma doctrine, first of all? I think there's a very simple way to put it. We reap what we sow. And this is true across the board in all Hindu traditions. We reap what we sow. But immediately a question comes up. And this is where, the moment we ask this follow-up question, I think a lot of people just say, I don't know. The question is, how exactly do we reap what we sow? What is that process like? I think there's a kind of lack of clarity in answering this question. So I want to try to clear this up, at least from the standpoint of our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda spiritual tradition. I think that we, according to the doctrine of karma, we reap what we sow at two levels, both of which are equally important. The first level is what I would call the psychological level, and the second level is the metaphysical level. So let me explain them one by one. At the psychological level, we reap what we sow in the sense that everything we do, every single act we perform in thought, word, and deed, leaves behind a trace in our minds called samskaras, latent mental impressions, which are in our unconscious. Freud talked about it in the early 19th century, late 20th century, early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. But Patanjali talked about it millennia ago, and so does Vedanta. So these samskaras in the unconscious, they work surreptitiously, and they make us do things which we're not even aware of what's actually causing us to do these things. They're samskaras. And those samskaras lead us to engage in certain patterns of behavior, habits, which then go into forming our character. Swami Vivekananda talks about this at length. I'll read out a passage, which I think is very helpful. He says, each action is like the pulsations quivering over the surface of the lake. The vibration dies out, and what is left? The samskaras, the impressions. When a large number of these impressions, samskaras, are left on the mind, they coalesce and become a habit. It is said habit is second nature. It is first nature also, and the whole nature of man. Everything that we are is the result of habit. That gives us consolation, because if it is only habit, we can make and unmake it at any time. The samskaras are left by these vibrations passing out of our mind, each one of them leaving its result. Our character is the sum total of these marks, and according as some particular wave prevails, one takes that tone. If good prevails, one becomes good. If wickedness, one becomes wicked. If joyfulness, one becomes happy. The only remedy for bad habits is counter habits. All the bad habits that have left their impressions are to be controlled by good habits. Go on doing good, thinking holy thoughts continuously. That is the only way to suppress base impressions. Never say any man is hopeless, because he only represents a character, a bundle of habits, which can be checked by new and better ones. And note the last sentence. Character is repeated habits, and repeated habits alone can reform character. So there's a lot here, but the basic idea is this. Our present character has been shaped by what we did, what we thought, and what we said in our past lives. So there's a kind of cycle or circle going on here. We engage in certain actions. Those actions leave samskaras, latent mental impressions, which form into habits. It makes us act in certain repeated ways, in patterns of behavior. Those habits then form our present character. And our character leads us to act and behave in certain ways. And so it's this kind of circle. But it shouldn't be considered to be a kind of fatalistic circle, a deterministic circle where we're stuck in it. It's a kind of vicious cycle. We can't escape. We have no free will. Not in that sense. Because from this empirical standpoint, we are free to make and unmake ourselves. That's what Swami Vivekananda says, which means we can counteract any of these unwholesome habits, any aspects of our character that we find to be unwholesome or unhealthy or not unhelpful in spiritual life, by cultivating good habits, opposite habits. And then we'll be able to change our habits and then reform our character in the process. So then that circle becomes a virtuous circle rather than a vicious one. Okay, so that is the explanation of the psychological level at which we reap what we sow. But there's an entirely different level, the metaphysical level, at which we also reap what we sow. I think this is more commonly known, but both are equally important. By engaging in a good action, in Sanskrit it's called a dharmika action, we generate punya, merit. And that merit ultimately results in us being reborn in favorable circumstances. It leads to sukham, happiness of some sort. It doesn't have to be in a very crude or vulgar sense, but just we are reborn in positive, favorable circumstances. But the opposite is also true. We engage in adharmika action, unwholesome actions, immoral actions. What happens? It generates papa, demerit. That papa leads us to be reborn in unfavorable, negative circumstances. Not just circumstances, but even with certain negative tendencies in our minds, negative samskaras, in our next life. Okay? So this is metaphysical. Notice how both of these work in tandem. We reap what we sow at both levels. At the psychological level, in the sense that it impinges on our character and helps to shape our current character. And at the metaphysical level, every act we do, whether good or bad, generates papa or punya, respectively, which then impacts the circumstances in which we're reborn, the kind of minds that we're born with in our next life. The locus classicus for the metaphysical doctrine of reaping what we sow is in Bhagavad Gita chapter 6. In verse 40, Bhagavan Krishna says, Nahi kalyana krit kaschid durgatim tata gacchati. He assures Arjuna, don't worry. Doers of good actions, good people, nothing bad will ever happen to them. They'll continue to make spiritual progress. What happens? He says in the next verse, 41, Prapya punyakatan lokan ushitva shashvati isamaha shuchinam shrimatam gehe yoga bhrashto vijayate. Krishna says, the person who does good in this life generates punya kritan. And he will go to these lokas, these realms beyond this earth, in which the soul will enjoy the fruits, the positive fruits of his good actions or her good actions. Ultimately being reborn here, but in a good family, in favorable circumstances, so that we can pick up where we left off and continue our moral and spiritual journeys. So that's the metaphysical side of how we reap what we sow. So keep in mind that when the karma doctrine says we reap what we sow, we should understand it both at a psychological level and at a metaphysical level. And they're not contradictory, they're kind of complementary, and both are equally true. So that's the first kind of aspect of the doctrine of karma, which I think there's a lot of unclarity about, so I want to clarify that. But there's another common, I think, misunderstanding of the Hindu karma doctrine, which is that it's a doctrine fundamentally of reward and punishment. It's so common and so commonly caricatured that you find it even in TV shows, and I want to mention one, but I have to censor it a little bit because there's a bad word in it. This is from The Big Bang Theory. Leonard Hofstadter, he's one of the main characters. I deliberately tried to sabotage Stuart's date with Penny. Rajesh Kutrapali, the Indian character in the show. Of course you feel terrible. You completely screwed up your karma, dude. Sheldon Cooper, the brilliant physicist. You don't really believe in that superstition, do you? Rajesh. It's not superstition, it's practically Newtonian. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Leonard pretends to be a friend and acts like a two-faced, and then there's a bad word. I won't say it. Therefore, he is reborn as a banana slug. It's actually a very elegant system. You know, what goes around comes around. That's the caricature. The caricature is, you do something bad, something terrible will happen to you, you'll be reborn as a banana slug, as a plant, something really horrible. And so if we really believe that the karma doctrine is like this, it's a doctrine of fear. I don't want to be born as a banana slug, so let me do good. Fortunately, I think this is a caricature. At least which I have to admit, because I'm a scholar, I have to be a little careful with it. There are some texts in traditional Hinduism which suggest a kind of crude calculus like this. We do something bad, something inversely but equal will happen to us that's very bad. Like I steal from someone in my next life, somebody's going to steal from me and harm me in the same way, and that kind of stuff. But in our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, it's not like that. That's just not the case. And the fundamental aim of the doctrines of karma and rebirth is not to reward us or to punish us, but to facilitate and foster our moral and spiritual growth. That's why I would contrast this kind of caricature of karma and rebirth as a doctrine of reward and punishment with the evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth that is, I think, a more accurate understanding of how we, as followers of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, understand karma and rebirth. What exactly is this evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth? The aim of karma, of reaping what we sow, and the aim of being born again and again, it's not primarily to reap the rewards of what we're doing, or to be punished if we do something bad, but to ultimately attain the highest goal of life, which is liberation, self-realization, God-realization. And karma and rebirth are the kind of aspects of the machinery that help us to make spiritual progress, to evolve morally and spiritually. Swami Vivekananda, he said, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. I think it's a very powerful teaching. That's what karma and rebirth help us to do. Through every experience, we should try to learn from it. As souls, what did we learn from this experience, and how do we move forward from that experience? So Sri Ramakrishna, when he was asked this question of why does God put us in very difficult situations, make us suffer, and his answer is very succinct and very powerful. He says, in order to create saints. Mohat lok toyer korben bole. It's very interesting. Then he says, one becomes a saint by conquering the senses. And unless you're confronted with both negative and positive situations, we can never grow morally and spiritually. So the purpose of karma and rebirth is not reward and punishment. It's our own moral and spiritual evolution. Swami Vivekananda says the same thing in a different way. He says, this world is a moral gymnasium in which we have come to grow strong. Just as you go to a gym and you pump iron, we're pumping moral iron. We're flexing and we're strengthening our moral and spiritual muscles by learning from all of our different experiences, good, bad, and otherwise, and growing as a result. Sri Aurobindo, I would say of all the modern Hindu thinkers, he's the one who has developed and defended an evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth in the most detail and with the greatest sophistication. So I want to read you a passage which I find really helpful and fascinating. He says, and he's starting by criticizing the caricature that I've been talking about, this idea of karma as a reward and punishment doctrine. He says, nor can good fortune and evil fortune, pleasure and pain, happiness and misery and suffering be taken as if they existed merely as incentives and deterrents to the natural being in its choice of good and evil. He's saying it's not like I do something good because I want a lollipop, and I avoid doing bad things because I don't want to be punished. He's criticizing that doctrine. He says, it is for experience, for growth of the individual being, that the soul enters into rebirth. Joy and grief, pain and suffering, fortune and misfortune are parts of that experience, means of that growth. Even, pay attention, this is very interesting, even the soul may of itself accept or choose poverty, misfortune, and suffering as helpful to its growth, stimulants of a rapid development, and reject riches and prosperity and success as dangerous and conducive to a relaxation of its spiritual effort. All the secret of the circumstances of rebirth centers around the one capital need of the soul, the need of growth, the need of experience. That governs the line of its evolution, and all the rest is accessory. So one thing that I think Sri Aurobindo adds to this idea that we're developing here of an evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth is the soul. Imagine a soul, maybe we're a king in this life. We enjoy all sorts of worldly pleasures, and we have it all. The soul, after leaving the body of the king, may choose to be born as a pauper in its next birth, and assume that the king actually did some wonderful things too, very moral, and which is rare, but it sometimes does happen. King Janaka. King Janaka is a good example, but we can't all be King Janakas, as Sri Ramakrishna would say. So anyway, but imagine a King Janaka. The soul of this king may choose to be born as a pauper in his next birth. See, karmically, he could easily enjoy all sorts of wonderful, very, very pleasant experiences in the next birth, but that's not going to help him spiritually. He says, no, I had the experience of a king, filthy rich, this and that, all sorts of worldly pleasures. Now I want the opposite, so that my soul can make further moral and spiritual progress. So this is what the caricature misses. And the other aspect of the caricature, which I think is important, which is also very kind of common in understandings of karma, is this banana slug point that Raj Kutrapali makes in Big Bang Theory, which is this kind of fear that, well, if we do bad things, we might be reborn as a banana slug or some bacteria or something, or some kind of plant. Now, the issue here is somebody asked Swami Vivekananda this question, and his answer was, yes, it's possible. If you do very beastly things, you might be born as a beast in your next life. But it's rare. It's very rare. And in general, once you're reborn as a human being, unless you do something really, really, really bad, you will continue to be reborn as a human being in the future and make further progress. Another big question that comes up in the context of the doctrines of karma and rebirth: who or what exactly reincarnates? What is the precise nature of the reincarnating entity? This is a question that might come up among people who even believe in the doctrine, but then they might have these doubts. Well, what exactly is it in me that reincarnates? One of the most common answers is the subtle body, the sukshma sharira or the linga sharira. Those are the Sanskrit terms. There's a problem with that answer. The problem is the subtle body, according to all Indian traditions, is insentient, not conscious. So just the subtle body by itself, it doesn't make much sense for that to be the reincarnating entity. The reincarnating entity has to be conscious, right? So what does Vedanta say? The Vedantic answer is the reincarnating entity is the jivatma, the conscious soul, associated with the subtle body. The jivatma, the conscious soul, in association with the subtle body. And what is the subtle body? The subtle body is mind, manas, buddhi, intellect, ahankara, I sense, and the senses, all taken as a package, which you can just call, especially from a Western standpoint, the word mind can cover all four, let's say, okay? So it's the conscious soul in association with the mind, which reincarnates from birth to birth and goes to other realms, enjoys in heaven, suffers in temporary hells, and so on. What's our scriptural evidence for this? There are multiple places where Vedantic scriptures talk about it, but I wanted to mention one. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 15, verse 8. Krishna explains that the jiva, when leaving the physical body, takes along with it the subtle body, described in the previous verse as being the mind combined with the senses, just as the wind takes the fragrances from a vase. A very beautiful metaphor. So the jivatma takes the subtle body along with it, just as the wind takes the fragrances from a vase. Shariram yadavapnoti yachapyutkramati ishvaraha grahitvaitani sanyati vayurgandhani vashayat. But again, there is some complexity in answering this question because there are other traditions of Hinduism which answer the question a bit differently, and I talk about that in the book in detail. I'll just flag two other ways that other Hindu traditions have answered the same question. What exactly is this reincarnating entity? Nyaya and Vaisheshika claim that the reincarnating entity is just the jivatman, and they don't posit a subtle body, as far as I'm aware. And on the other side, Sankhya says the reincarnating entity is a subtle body, but they don't posit a jivatma, a conscious soul. But I think Vedanta gives the best answer. I'm biased, but I still think that, and I go into the details in my book, but jivatma in association with the subtle body, that's my answer. I stick to it. Okay. And finally, these evolutionary doctrines of karma and rebirth entail a third doctrine, which is absolutely fundamental to our tradition, which is universal liberation. Every single one of us will make it in the end. Without exception, there's no eternal hell. And how do you explain it? You need to give some justification. How is it that we are all going to be liberated in the end? Because of these evolutionary doctrines of karma and rebirth. We don't get it right this time, we'll come back again. As many times as it takes. We might even regress in a particular life. I don't think Hitler made much progress in his life. Even he's not doomed. Just imagine. This is what Vedanta assures us. He's going to come back. He might have to come back as a banana slug. But in any case, we don't know. But eventually that banana slug, the soul of the banana slug, will be reborn as a human being, and that soul will continue to make spiritual and moral progress. So that's really important. Sri Ramakrishna would say, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 a.m, at dawn, other people at noon, other people in the evening, other people late at night, midnight, but nobody will be left without food in the end. So what does that mean? We're not all going to be liberated together, holding hands. That's not the way it works. One person, a very advanced soul, might get liberation in this life. Another person after 1,000,000 lives. Another person after 4 lives. But everybody will make it in the end. That's the consolation. That should give us hope, right? There's no eternal hell in our tradition, thank God. So now, second part of the talk. What are some of the main arguments in support of karma and rebirth? I want to mention 3 of them in particular. The argument from verified reports of past life memories. Notice the word verified here, because the argument from reports of past life memories wouldn't be nearly as strong, because a lot of people make all sorts of outlandish claims. And people prefer to say, I was somebody really famous in a past life. I was Cleopatra. I was Elvis. Nobody wants to just be an ordinary dude in a past life. So no, there's no reason to accept these claims, right? But we have to pause when we're confronted with claims about a past life that can be empirically verified. Those are the relevant kinds of reports and claims. 2 of the main researchers who have done really rigorous research in this area are Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker. And I'd especially recommend some of Jim Tucker's recent work. There's a book that came out recently called Before, Children's Memories of Previous Lives. And it's a combination of actually 2 books. So you get 2 for the price of 1, Amazon. And he investigates fascinating cases. And one thing that's really helpful in Jim Tucker's research is that he's looking at cases in America where kids aren't raised with the belief in karma and rebirth. And there's a striking example. There's a kid who was 2 years old. Now he's in his, I think, early 20s or something. James Leininger. 2 years old. He's in his crib, presumably. Has terrible nightmares, and he shouts these random things. His parents hear him. Airplane crash on fire. Airplane crash on fire. And he's terrified, and he's crying. Can't sleep at night. And their parents get worried after some time. They notice that he's having the same recurring nightmare again and again. And when he wakes up, they ask him, what exactly are you talking about? And he says, I was a fighter pilot in my previous birth. During World War II, I was in Japan. He gave the name of his aircraft carrier, USS Natoma Bay. He gave the name of his friend, Jack. And he said his own name was James. And his parents are obviously stunned. His father, Bruce, does research on this, looks up in history books that all of those facts tally with what happened to a fighter pilot named James, who was a World War II fighter pilot in Japan. So this is a good example, but there are many others of verified reports of past life memories. So that's one, I think, strong argument for karma and rebirth. I'm not saying it's airtight, but I think this evidence is formidable enough that it needs to be taken seriously. It can't be dismissed out of hand. You should assess it carefully. 2 more arguments in favor of karma and rebirth. Both of these arguments presuppose the existence of God. Now you might think, well, that's a lot to swallow. That's a separate issue. That would be a separate issue. Does God exist? I can give a separate lecture on that, and then I'll talk about arguments in favor of that. But now, assuming that there is a God, and you're asking yourself, should we accept a theistic paradigm that accepts karma and rebirth as well, or a theistic paradigm that's one life only, that believes that this is the be-all and end-all, that there's only one life, and that's it? Here are the two arguments. One, assuming that there is a God, why in the world are children, babies, born into such radically different circumstances, born with such radically different genetic tendencies? Some are born with terrible diseases that turn out to be fatal. Some are born in incredibly impoverished circumstances. They don't get the basic opportunities for living well, whereas other kids are born with a silver spoon in their mouths. How do you explain it? Is God unfair? How do you explain it? If there's a God, how do you explain these inequalities? Karma and rebirth provide the best explanation of why there are these kinds of inequalities in this world. Because it says that these babies, the souls of those babies have lived before. And everybody reaps what they sow. That's the idea. So Swami Vivekananda, he makes this argument. And there are many other modern Hindus like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and others who make the same kind of argument. So the argument is that a one-life theistic paradigm, the Orthodox Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on, they have a very, very hard time explaining 2-year-old babies with cerebral meningitis or some kind of fatal case of cancer. It's extremely difficult. And they've directly tried to address these questions, but I don't think any of their answers are particularly convincing. They all impugn the justice of God. So the only way to save God, get God off the hook, is to believe in the doctrines of karma and rebirth. But there's another argument, also assuming the existence of God. It's called so if the argument I just explained is the inequality argument, that people are born into unequal situations, this argument could be called the multiple shots argument. The idea is, you can already, just from the name, you can figure it out. Yeah. Spiritual life is hard, as we all know. We all know that as spiritual aspirants. And the goal is very, very lofty. It's the highest possible goal that we can imagine. God realization, self-realization, liberation. We've been coming again and again for so many birds. Is it plausible that a loving and omniscient and omnipotent God would create this world in such a way that we get only one chance to make it or break it? Is it really plausible? It's crazy. To do anything meaningful and serious, there's a trial and error process. To write a dissertation, I did a PhD a long time ago. I make mistakes. I write a page and then I say, this is terrible, and I rewrite it. It stands to reason that if the goal is the highest possible goal and it's not easy to attain, God will create this world with the doctrines of karma and rebirth built into it so that we have multiple shots at liberation. Not just multiple, as many shots as we need. That's the beauty of it. Because remember, we'll all make it out in the end. Not at the same time, but eventually. So that's the multiple shots argument. Bhagavad Gita again, 6.45, chapter 6, verse 45, says that the yogi attains spiritual perfection aneka janma samsiddhaha, by becoming gradually purified in perfection in the course of many, many lifetimes. Aneka janma samsiddhas, that's the idea. Now, that's all well and good, but there are also some pretty powerful and intuitive, or at least seemingly powerful and intuitive arguments against the doctrines of karma and rebirth. Let me mention 3 of them. There are many more. I've got a whole chapter of my book. Chapter 3 is on arguments for rebirth, and chapter 4 of the book is arguments against karma and rebirth. One very intuitive objection, which I think occurs to many of us, is what I would call the lack of memory objection. Okay, if you say we have past lives, why the heck don't most of us remember our past lives? Doesn't it stand to reason that if we lived before that we would have memories of those past lives? 3 basic lines of response. So think about it, and I want you to think for yourselves about it. But I think that there are 3 main lines of response here. First line of response. Just because we don't have a memory of something doesn't mean that we didn't live at that time. What's a good example? How many of you remember anything from age 0 to 6 months when you were a baby in a crib? I can guarantee, I assume none of you do. Look at that. Myron does. Okay, Myron's one exception. So we got, look at that. He's raising his hand. All right, well, more power to you. In general, though, most of us don't have memories of of being 6-month-old babies. Yet, isn't it obvious that We're the same person now as we were then. A lot has changed. We don't look like babies, and we've developed our brains and all that. Every cell in our body might have changed, but we're the same person. So just because we don't have memory of something doesn't mean that we didn't exist at that time. Okay. Same thing goes with past lives. Just because we don't have memory of our past lives doesn't mean we didn't live them. Okay. Second line of response. Thank the Lord that we don't have memories of our past lives. Sister Nivedita once asked Vivekananda this question: why don't we remember our past lives if we've lived before? He says, quoting Jesus, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Because we've done enough stupid things in this life. And if we were saddled with memories of all the stupid things we did in our past lives, we would become emotional wrecks, psychological basket cases. So thank God. God in his wisdom, her wisdom, has withheld memories of past lives from us so that we're not crippled in this life, so we can make moral and spiritual progress. There's a new trend now, which is kind of encouraging us to try to figure out what we were in past lives, past life regression, hypnosis therapy, and these kinds of things. And I'm not saying it's all bad. In some cases, it could be helpful, especially if you're dealing with trauma, things like that. You can actually kind of trace what might have happened in a past life to lead to the current circumstances. That's okay. But there's a danger in it becoming overly popularized and used for the wrong purposes. There are a lot of frauds out there who actually have no knowledge of these things and who just want a way to get rich quickly. And secondly, just from the standpoint of somebody it's easy to get into this kind of state of morbid curiosity about what we were in past lives, which is absolutely unhelpful in spiritual life. How will that help us? And think about it again. There's a good reason why we don't have memories of our past lives. So I would suggest not opening the Pandora's box unless absolutely necessary. Finally, this is a little bit more subtle line of response, the third line of response to this lack of memory objection. Even if we don't have memories now of what we did in our past lives, we could still have latent memories of our past lives. And this is what, in fact, Vedanta and yoga claim. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there's a sutra, Sakshat Karana, Purva Jati Jnanam, what is it again? Sakshat Karanat Purva Jati Jnanam, something like that. I'm missing the first word. But the basic idea is, each one of us has latent memories of our past lives, and by meditating on those latent memories, there's a yogic process. It's called sanyama. You concentrate deeply on those samskaras, those latent mental impressions left by what we did in past lives. We can actually gain memories of our past lives. So that's one way that these latent memories can come to the surface. But there's another way. Swami Vivekananda himself says, each one of us will get back this memory of past lives in that life in which he will become free. Each one of us eventually will regain our memories of past lives. We're just not ready for it yet, and it's not going to help us spiritually and morally, but eventually we'll get that when we need it and when it's helpful to us. And that's another, I think, a very powerful response to this lack of memory objection. Second objection against the doctrines of karma and rebirth is what might be called the blame the victim objection. It's a very interesting objection. The doctrine of karma is fundamentally immoral. Why? The scholar Whitley Kaufman raises this objection quite forcefully. He says, the karma doctrine entails that there is no such thing as innocent suffering, that everyone gets just what he deserves. But then, there can be no moral obligation to help others in distress, to protect, to rescue, perform acts of charity, or even to feel compassion for a sufferer. Karma elevates the blame the victim idea into a systematic principle. A lot of people think this is a devastating objection to the doctrine of karma, and it's an interesting and intuitive one. If we all reap what we sow and we see somebody suffering, let the person suffer, work out his or her karma. That's exactly right. That's the well, is it exactly right? That's the question. So, how might somebody who believes in karma and rebirth respond to this objection? First, imagine that there's a poor soul suffering next to us. What should be our attitude as people who believe in karma and rebirth? First of all, if it's that person's bad karma, which is causing the present suffering of that person, it's the result of that same suffering person's good karma that we are in a position to help that person. We shouldn't forget that. No man is an island. John Donne, I think, said that, right? Our respective karmas, karmic histories, are bound up in extraordinarily complex ways. in ways that we can't begin to imagine, but which God, as the omniscient being, understands perfectly. And so we're all linked up in very, very complex ways. So we should never play God. That's the important thing. We should never say to ourselves when we see somebody suffering, oh yeah, just let that person suffer because he or she is just working out her karma. No, you are there in a position to help that person. You're going to accrue bad karma if you don't help the person. That's another part of the answer. And it's because of that person's that suffers good karma that you're in a position to help that person. So that should be the attitude. If you're ever confronted with a case of somebody who is in suffering and you are in a position to help that person and serve that person, you should, according to the karma doctrine. Because that's the way to accrue good karma, that's the way to ultimately make moral and spiritual progress, and you can never say that that person should wallow in suffering for the rest of his or her life. How can you say that? You don't have sufficient knowledge. But you do know that you are in a position to help that person because of that person's good karma. Okay, so that's the first response. Oh, actually, both of these responses they're kind of, I combine them. And Arvind Sharma, a scholar in Canada, he gave a good example. He says, imagine somebody who has been a chain smoker his or her entire life and then feels terrible, goes to a doctor. The doctor diagnoses this person with lung cancer. The doctor will tell the patient, well, look, I mean, it's almost certainly the case that it was your lifelong chain smoking habit that led to your current lung cancer. Would it be logical or moral or sane for the doctor to then say, therefore, I'm not going to help you? No. It's the doctor's obligation, first of all, to inform the patient of the cause of the condition. You reap what you sow. But of course, I'm going to help you to the best of my ability. So think about the karma doctrine using this analogy. I think that really helps. A third very intuitive objection to the doctrines of karma and rebirth is what could be called the population explosion objection. I've heard this many, many times from both Hindus and non-Hindus. If there's a fixed number of souls, we seem to have a problem on our hands. In 1960, there were about 3 billion people. Now there's about 8.1 or 2 billion people. Where the heck are all these souls coming from to inhabit these bodies, these human bodies? Simple response, fortunately, for people who believe in karma and rebirth. There's a two-pronged response to this. Number one, souls can inhabit not just human bodies, but also non-human animal bodies and plants. Most Hindu traditions also hold that plants are ensouled. And Swamiji says something really interesting here, Swami Vivekananda. He says, it is a significant fact that as the human population is increasing, the animal population is decreasing. He means non-human animals. We're also animals, but the animal souls are all becoming men, Vivekananda says. It's very interesting. So you can account for the exponential increase in our population, human population, by saying that the number of souls inhabiting non-human animal bodies and plants are actually getting promoted, or they're graduating to a human birth, you can say. But another part of the answer is this is not the only realm in which souls reside. There are also other lokas, other realms. There are temporary heavens, there are temporary hells, and so on and so forth, where these souls exhaust their karma. And then they get reborn again. So the idea is there are souls in other places, which if you take into account all the souls in non-human animal bodies and in plants and in other lokas, it can actually very easily explain this population explosion problem. Now, next question. Because I've been talking about a lot of philosophy and abstraction, how is all this stuff relevant to us as spiritual aspirants? Does it affect our spiritual life? Does it impact our spiritual life? Does it enrich our spiritual life in any way? Why should we believe in these doctrines of karma and rebirth? Even if they're true, how does it help us from a spiritual standpoint? First of all, a clue to the importance of these doctrines from a spiritual standpoint is that if you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the Kathamrita, you find that Sri Ramakrishna refers to the doctrines of karma and rebirth almost on every page. He's constantly referring to it. And he says in one place, for instance, he says, Purva janma samskar mante hai, something like that. He says, you have to accept past life samskaras, past life tendencies inherited from what we did in the past. Why? So I want to talk about some of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings to explain the relevance of these doctrines to our spiritual life. But I also did something interesting a few months ago. I crowdsourced this question in a class that I teach on the Bhagavad Gita. Some of my students are sitting here today. And I asked this question: do you believe in karma and rebirth? And if so, do you find these doctrines, belief in these doctrines, helpful in your day-to-day spiritual life? And I got fascinating answers, very thoughtful answers. And I want to read to you some of those answers as well. So, what are some of the practical spiritual benefits of believing in karma and rebirth? And there are many, and I'm just going to mention a few. First, if we believe in karma and rebirth, we won't fear death anymore. Amazing. That itself, it's worth the price of admission. Not to be afraid of dying. Because our souls will never die, as Krishna tells Arjuna 100 times in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. That's why I started this talk with that beautiful verse, 2.22 from the Bhagavad Gita. It completely changes the way we think about ourselves. We're souls inhabiting bodies like we wear a set of clothes that we could just cast off at the end of the day, and then we put on new clothes. Nothing to worry about. One of my students, he said something along these lines. He says, "The doctrine of rebirth is a great solace when it comes to how I view mortality. I used to fear death for myself and loved ones, but the doctrine of rebirth has helped to ease that." And he mentions not just his own death, but of his loved ones. So that's the second major thing. Even if we're not afraid of dying ourselves, often we're terrified of the prospect of our spouse dying, our kids dying, something like that. And again, the doctrines of karma and rebirth come to the rescue, because we know that the souls of our loved ones will never perish. It's an incredible source of consolation. Third, our belief in karma and rebirth help us not to be so attached to the Tom, Dick, and Harry that we are in this particular life. It encourages us to take a step back from our empirical personality and not to take ourselves so seriously. I think a big problem in life is that we take ourselves too seriously. This is a way to laugh at ourselves and recognize that we are souls inhabiting this, assuming this empirical personality for the purposes of this birth, and that we won't be this person in our next birth, and that we weren't that person in our previous birth. It takes the edge off things, and I think that's really useful in spiritual life. Otherwise, what happens is we become so attached and identified with this empirical personality that even when we think about lofty spiritual goals like a heaven or something, we want that empirical I to survive in the highest state of heaven. It needs to be Swami Medhananda up in heaven. It's a very crude way of thinking, actually. Fourth, if we really internalize the teachings of karma and rebirth, it completely changes the way we look upon ourselves. It changes our fundamental identity. Instead of thinking of ourselves as bodies or even as minds, we think about ourselves as souls. I think of myself as a soul, I talk to you as souls, and I interact with you as souls. And that's incredibly empowering. It completely spiritualizes our entire outlook on life. Fifth, knowing that our current circumstances, whatever things we were born with, any tendencies, whatever circumstances we were born into, whatever suffering we're undergoing now, knowing that this is the result of something we did in a past life or something earlier in this life, based on the doctrines of karma and rebirth, is incredibly empowering because it makes us take responsibility for ourselves instead of feeling sorry for ourselves. Because one of the biggest impediments in spiritual life is getting into this kind of rut or a kind of depression where we're, oh, woe is me. This is never helpful in spiritual life. So this is one of the keynotes of Swami Vivekananda's teachings. When he talked about karma and rebirth, he said the fundamental practical import of these doctrines is that we are responsible for our current state, and therefore we can improve. It's in our hands to become better and to counteract bad habits with good habits, as he said earlier. Sri Ramakrishna said the same thing. Lonka khele jhal lagbe na. Won't your tongue burn if you eat a chili? It's a fact. But we should take responsibility for it. Paul Deussen, the great German Sanskritist scholar that Swami Vivekananda had met, when he came to India on a trip, he met a poor blind man, and he asked that gentleman, how do you see yourself and think about your condition? I'm so sorry to see you in this condition. He says, I must have committed some terrible sins in a past life to deserve this. But see, He doesn't know what those sins are, and you don't need detailed knowledge. But see how empowering the idea is. He doesn't feel sorry for himself. He lives his life, taking responsibility for it. Another practical benefit of believing in the doctrines of karma and rebirth, it helps us to gain a better and deeper understanding of ourselves and of other people. But let's start with ourselves first. So Sri Ramakrishna gives an example. It's a little funny. There's a person who's spending his entire life doing intense sadhana, spiritual practice, meditating all day on this tiger skin. At the end of his life, a tiger, not at the end of his life, but the tiger in the midst of his spiritual practice just beats him, kills him. And a person notices this, who's just hanging out nearby, not a spiritual aspirant, or doesn't think he is one, and says, "Let me sit on that tiger seat." That guy's gone now. So he says, he's just kind of dabbling in spiritual practice. Let me shut my eyes and say, and within minutes, Divine Mother appears. And this guy's completely shocked. And he says, wait a minute, this person that has just been eaten by a tiger has spent his entire life in spiritual practice, very sincere, and I'm just a nobody who just sat on this seat, and within minutes you're showing yourself? Explain yourself, O Mother. She says, you don't understand. You have been praying to me, calling on me, and engaging in intense austerities and spiritual practices for many, many lifetimes. You just don't know it. So this also is very helpful to understand each one of us, even twins, identical twins, are actually radically different souls. And you can see that. They are very different in their behavior in many cases. Why? Because they're born with different tendencies. So it's a really helpful way to understand ourselves, have a deeper understanding of ourselves, to accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth. I wanted to mention one of the students from my class who says this. He says, karma and rebirth also help to provide a framework for my understanding of myself. I used to feel odd that I seemed to be more spiritually minded than many of my peers, and that I'm so attracted to spiritual philosophy, as many of us are. That's why we're sitting here. The idea that these interests may be a result of spiritual interest in past lives helps me to embrace these aspects of myself and understand them as a natural continuation, not a single life obsession. I love the language too. Not a single life obsession, like it's a fad. And you get worried sometimes, like, am I doing something wrong? Am I a weirdo? Because a lot of people call me a weirdo, and other people are partying and I'm coming to Sunday talks. So no, this is something that has been going on it's been cultivated for many, many lifetimes. Another thing, so we can better understand the shortcomings, the weaknesses, and the struggles of other human beings if we accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth. We'll be more sympathetic, empathetic, and compassionate toward them, knowing that each of us is struggling with our past life samskaras. And it's not easy to fight with these samskaras. It's possible, and as Swami Vivekananda would emphasize, we can counter bad habits with good habits, but it's not easy. And so we should show that kind of empathy for other people. Again, a student from my class says this really nicely. He says, the idea of rebirth, more specifically samskaras, latent mental impressions, helps me to view the psychological struggles and idiosyncrasies of myself and others with more compassion. And another nice thing he adds is that we should also try to cultivate empathy for ourselves. Sometimes we're too hard on ourselves in spiritual life. So we should give ourselves a break too, without slackening our efforts. But let's not beat ourselves up for our shortcomings. And finally, this evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth should give us hope and confidence, as I said. Why? Because each of us will come out in the end. And that's an incredible source of reassurance. Each one of us will succeed. Spiritual life is tough, but we'll all make it. Because we have multiple shots. We have enough shots as we need to make it in the end. We're going to come back again until we succeed. I wanted to mention a different student in my class who said, this is another reason why he found the doctrines of karma and rebirth very helpful and practical. He says, rebirth is an opportunity for greater realization and an understanding of inner characteristics and inclinations, and the perspective it gives keeps me on a more even keel. So thinking about yourself as engaging in a long spiritual journey. Each one of us is running the same spiritual marathon. But the beauty of this marathon, unlike ordinary marathons, is that we're not competing with each other. In fact, we're helping each other, or at least we should think about ourselves as helping each other. This reminds me of, I ran one official half marathon a long time ago in the Humboldt Redwoods Forest. It's a beautiful place. It was a beautiful marathon long back when I was doing my PhD. And it's 13.1 miles. I'm cruising along, going at a good pace for the first 10 miles, 11 miles, and then suddenly I hit this wall. And I'm almost thinking I start slowing down, almost ready to stop. And then this wonderful lady who's also in the same race, she comes up to me and she says, "Keep going, you're almost there." And that's it. And then that just gave me this strength and this inspiration to keep going. And I finished the marathon, the half marathon along with her. It's like that. We're all running this very, very long spiritual journey of many lifetimes, and we should be helping each other. Because this is not a zero-sum competition where if that person wins, I don't win. All of us are winners. What a wonderful game in which all of us win. The game is rigged, but in a good way. And another student from my class said something really insightful, which I'd never heard before. That's why one of the best things about teaching these classes is I get to learn from my students. So the student says, "Believing in karma and rebirth also has completely changed the way that I think about raising children." Many of you are parents. Father's Day. How? He says the following. "I think karma and rebirth have changed my views about raising children. The idea that I'm nurturing a soul that has been here many times and is on its own specific journey helps me to view parenting with more of a stewardship and guidance lens and not a possessive mentality. I see no need to create a carbon copy, shape a child completely to my own ideals, or save them from eternal damnation." And then he says something really interesting. "I understand that a soul may have chosen me to help them along in this part of their journey. It's a subtle but powerful shift." So I think this is very profound and insightful, and it can really change the way that we think about how we should raise our children. This is a great way to avoid helicopter parenting, this kind of hovering over our children, trying to mold them in our own image. I'm a mechanical engineer, and so you have to be a mechanical engineer. On Father's Day, that's a shout out to my father. All right. Well, it's exactly 12 o'clock. Perfect note to end on. Thank you. Some announcements. I'll be greeting all of you right outside that door now. There are refreshments outside, so please help yourself. And we'll be holding a Q&A in the greenhouse living room next to the bookstore after refreshments. And it's the 16th. So next Sunday, June 23rd, Swami Vedarupanandaji will be giving a talk on the spirit birds. And are there any other announcements I should make? No? I think we're good. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Rama Krishna Arpanamastu.